today. Let's start with a word of prayer and then we'll dive in. Father in heaven, we come before you at this time just thanking you for another opportunity to gather and study together. Pray that our time might be beneficial here today and encouraging to each other and glorifying to you. Thank you for Marta being here who's visiting us from New Mexico. Just keep her safe on her travels and just help us to be encouraging to her as well, and just be with those who might be sick or others who might be sick or traveling, and help keep them safe. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're studying through Genesis, as you know. Let's open up to chapter 30 this morning as we continue making our way through this great book. Here in Genesis 30, the author of Genesis is continuing the story of Jacob. And one thing we know up to this point in Genesis is that Jacob has basically been sent away from his home because of some conflict with his brother Esau. And in that process, he's met a shepherdess named Rachel, but as we know from the story, he ended up being married to both Rachel and her older sister, Leah. So it's this story of Jacob, along with his two wives, Rachel and Leah, that the author of Genesis continues telling in chapter 30 by recording in verses 1 through 24 the story of the birth of what would eventually become the 12 sons of Jacob. But before we get too far into that, one thing we know about Bible history is in the original, when the Bible was originally written, it was not divided neatly into chapters and verses as we have it today. It was all one document. It was our translators that divided it into chapters and verses. And one thing you'll find occasionally as you're studying through chapters and verses is there are what's called bad chapter breaks. And this is one of those instances, because the story of the birth of the sons of Jacob really begins at the end of chapter 29. And in my personal opinion, chapter 30 really should have began in verse 31 of chapter 29, because that's where the story of the sons really begins. But putting that aside, the story of the birth of Jacob's sons does continue into the first 24 verses of chapter 30, where we read about 7 additional sons of Jacob that would eventually give rise to what we know as the 12 tribes of Israel, in keeping with God's promise to Abraham, and he would be the father of a long line of descendants. Now, with that being true, what the author of Genesis does in chapter 30, verses 1 through 24, is record for us a couple of points as to how these 7 sons of Jacob were born. But in addition to those sons, there was one daughter that we're told about in these verses. So what we're going to find, the points we're going to look at, is that in verses 1 through 21, we find that these sons were born from different women. And then in verses 22 through 24, we find that his sons were born from God's help. And one application we'll take from these things is that all the good things in our lives that do come, be it children or anything else, they come from God's help. So that in mind, we'll just go ahead and read through the whole story, and then we'll examine these verses. So again, that's Genesis 30, beginning in verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" She said, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children." So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me, and has indeed heard my voice, and has given me a son." Therefore she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed," and she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "How fortunate." So she named him Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "Happy am I, for women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. Now in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "Therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons." So she named him Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." She named him Joseph, saying, "May the Lord give me another son." So this is the story of the birth of more of Jacob's sons here in verse 1 through 24. But the point this first point that we're going to be looking at is introduced in verses 1 through 8. In verses 1 through 8, what we find is a conversation between Rachel and Jacob, which would ultimately result in the birth of Jacob's fifth son, Dan, and also his sixth son, Naphtali. Now, what's the first thing Rachel says to Jacob there in verse 1? "Give me children or I will die." Why would she say that? Why put it in those words? Okay, blaming him. Any other ideas? Absolutely. So, absolutely. So that's probably where she's coming from, is that if she felt worthless, is what Pam said, she didn't have any children, because having children was very important back then. It was, if a woman did not have children back then, they, in a way, would have felt that they were cursed by God. So she says to Jacob, "Give me children," and she feels like she will die if she doesn't have children. Now we know she was barren. That was from verse 31 of chapter 29 is where we find that information. So how does Jacob respond in verse 2? And what does he ask her? Exactly. So that's why he's become angry. It's not Jacob's fault that she couldn't have children. So he asked her, "Am I God? Am I the one who's able to open your womb?" Basically, and that's putting my own words. So Jacob is not at fault, and because he's not in the place of God. So questions or comments up to this point before we get into verse 3? That's true. Right. That is very true. Yeah, verse 1.
Probably wasn't long before Jacob got involved in the household too, but back when they were just sisters in their father Laban's house. But yeah, definitely no, does not seem to be any love lost between these two sisters.
That's true. This is all coming from a sense of jealousy. We definitely see that in verse 1. So she's probably partially angry as well, but it's mostly jealousy that's driving this. So she says to Jacob, "Give me children. If not, I will die." And Jacob responds the way that he does. So what's the solution in verse 3? What does Rachel do? Okay, why is it a common practice? Where else did that happen? Exactly. So, yeah. So we saw with Sarah, give them the maid, which was a servant of sorts in the household. So she says there, I'll just read again. Here's my maid Bilhah. Go into her that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children. So she's offering the maid for them to have relations with each other. And this phrase, that she may bear upon my knees, it's a phrase that refers to the fact that even though this child would have been born through Bilhah, the child would belong to Rachel. So, and essentially, Rachel will adopt this child, even though it'd be born through another person. So, with all that being true, in verses 4 and 5, the author records that Jacob did as Rachel requested. Bilhah conceives and gives to Jacob a son. How does Rachel respond in verse 6? Okay, what does it mean to be vindicated? Okay, judged. That would be a good word there. But how does Rachel feel based on the language, her language there? She feels satisfied. She feels God has showed her some favor. And yes, this word vindicated, it does come from a word that means to judge. So judged is a good word to have there if you have an alternate translation. And it's applied here to say that God has judged in Rachel's favor. So again, the picture is courtroom language. You have the judge sitting up there. He issues down a sentence and says, well, this person is innocent. So Rachel's feeling like God has judged her favorably, as evidenced by the son. As a result, the son receives the name Dan. And when we hear the word Dan, what is that, or the name Dan, what is that name usually short for? Daniel. That's where the name comes from. It's a shortened form of the name Daniel. Now, if you don't already know this, the name Daniel means he judged, or in this case, God has judged. And in this context, it means God has judged favorably upon Rachel. Questions or comments on verse 6? Yeah, it does bring, there is some conflict going on here. It does. It has brought problems here, and it continued to bring problems. Anything else on verse 6? Sandy? Yeah, there is a lot of manipulation going on here. That's for sure. And we're going to see Leah do some of it as well a little bit later in the text. Anything else? Okay. So going on to verses 7 and 8, Bilhah conceives a second son who would receive the name Naphtali. Now, in these verses, the author seems to be recording that Rachel once again gave Bilhah to Jacob as a wife in order that he might have relations with her, which again results in the conception of and birth of what would be the second son from Bilhah. But if you're keeping track of the numbers, this would be the sixth son of Jacob since chapter 29. But how does Rachel feel what's her response there? What does she say in verse 8? That's it. So she sees this as a fight with her sister. We have that wrestling language. But she says, and then the New American Standard, with mighty wrestlings. Now, you don't see it in the English, but that phrase, mighty wrestlings, could be literally translated as wrestling of God. So Rachel believes, putting it in the context, that she's been wrestling alongside God with her sister, and that God has basically given her the victory, which is why she names her son Naphtali. That name Naphtali means wrestler. So that's why she gives him this name, because she's seen herself in a struggle with her sister, but God has been on her side. Again, that's in her mind. Anything else on verse 8 or 7? Okay. So that brings us into verses 9 through 13. We come back to Leah. Leah responds to the birth of these two sons that were born through Bilhah. And this ultimately results in the birth of Jacob's seventh and eighth sons named Gad and Asher. Now, this section is introduced obviously in verse 9. What's Leah's observation that she makes? What does she do? Exactly. There's more competition going on. So she does the same thing, gives her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife. Now, context indicates that her reason for doing this was so that she could have more children through Zilpah. So, verses 10 through 13, the author records the birth of Zilpah's two sons, Gad and Asher. Again, these would be sons that Leah would adopt as her own. So in verse 11, how does Leah respond? Oh, wait, sorry, that's the wrong question. It says, then the angel of God said to me in the dream, I'm reading the wrong chapter. I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead to verse 31. Chapter 31. I was like, that's not right. So it says, then Leah said, how fortunate, so she named him Gad. How's she feeling? And what does that mean? She's blessed. So it's just that positive feelings that she has. So she names him Gad, a name that means fortune. But then we have the second son. If we jump down to verse 13, what does she say there? Happy am I. As a result, the name becomes Asher. Now that's a name we're familiar with because we have a little boy in our congregation named Asher. The name means happy. And I think our Asher lives up to his name. So, and it's all coming from how Leah is feeling. Questions or comments on any of that through verse 13 or before? Okay. So that brings us into verses 14 and 15. A conversation that occurs between Rachel and Leah, and we get some more details in this part of the story. Leah's son Reuben, he goes out and finds some mandrakes, which he brings to his mother. Now, can anyone tell me what mandrakes are? No, they're not animals. Okay? Exactly. So these were very significant. So yes, these mandrakes are kind of a fruit. They're a plant of sorts. So Reuben goes out into the field, finds some, happens upon them. Yes, it was believed that mandrakes could induce fertility, help a woman become pregnant, as Rachel was desiring to do. But how does Leah respond in verse 15? What does she say? What does the text say? Exactly. Leah tells Rachel, "You've already taken my husband." Because as has already been pointed out, Jacob loves Rachel more than he does Leah. So now she's basically asking, "You want to take something else from me? My son's mandrakes?" So what do they come up with? How does Rachel respond to what Leah says? She bargains. Exactly. So they make a deal. He's like, "Okay, I'll give you my husband in exchange for the mandrakes." And again, this is all for the purpose of conception, the relations, and continuing to have sons. Questions or comments on that before we get into verse 16 and following? We don't know. Yeah, it is a very odd situation. Anything else? Okay. So this brings us to verses 16 through 21. Another conversation. It's a conversation that occurs between Leah and Jacob. And this conversation consists of the fact that Leah informs Jacob of the agreement that was made between her and Rachel. And this ultimately results in the birth of 2 more sons in addition to 1 daughter. So, verse 16, it says, "When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, 'You must come into me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes.' So he lay with her that night." And what is Leah saying to Jacob here? "I bought you. I hired you. I've employed you, Jacob." What kind of language is that? What's she doing here? It's kind of that of a slave owner, but I'll also submit to you this. This is almost like prostitute kind of language that is being used here, at least in this particular situation. So Leah tells Jacob, "I've hired you, so you have to have relations with me." And that's because of the agreement that was made. Leah's given Rachel the mandrakes, and Rachel in exchange says, "I'm going to have Jacob lie with you." So there's a demand being made here. So as a result, in verses 17 through 21, God allowed Leah to have 2 more sons in addition to 1 daughter. Now, when we read these verses, the point of emphasis in verses 17 through 21, it seems to be that Leah recognizes that it's God who has allowed her to have the children named in these verses. Now, another point of emphasis in these verses is on the sons that were born to Leah, because it's only of the sons that the author of Genesis describes how and why they received the names that they did. There's only one little blurb about Dinah, but there's no elaboration on Dinah like there is with the sons. So that brings us into verse 18. What does Leah say in response to the 5th son from verse 17? Exactly. So it's wages. And again, this happened through the maid, because it says there, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. So as a result, this son receives the name Issachar. Now, as we come to this verse, just to elaborate a little bit more, the first thing we should understand is that what Leah says here implies that she, like Rachel, used her maid to have this son. But even though the text says that, even though the text says that it is Leah who conceived, this conception took place through her maid, Zilpah. But another possibility is that Leah did in fact conceive the son herself, and sees this as God rewarding her for supplying Zilpah to be the surrogate mother of Gad and Asher. But whatever the case, the point Leah is making here in her statement is that because God has given her her wages, she gave her name the son Issachar. It's a name that means either hired worker or reward. So this has to do, again, with how she feels about the birth of this particular son. Questions or comments on verse 18? Does it make sense? Okay. So, verses 19 and 20, the sixth son of Leah. Now there in verse 19 says, Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. What does Leah say in response to the birth of this sixth son? Mm-hmm. That, that's it. She's given him six sons, and now she's believing again, my husband's going to give me love, dwell with me, the text says. So, as a result, this son receives the name Zebulun. The name Zebulun is a name that means honor. So this part of this is Leah's feeling like God is honoring her. So she's expressing that belief. God has honored me with the birth of this son, which she believes is going to lead to Jacob dwelling with her. But this won't be the case. Questions or comments on verse 20 before we look briefly at Dinah? Okay. So the author concludes this section by recording the fact of the birth of Leah's only daughter, Dinah. Now, there's no response to the birth of Dinah recorded here, but what we can know about Dinah is that her name means justice. Now, also, something else we know about Dinah is something we read about in Genesis 34. She's dishonored by a man named Shechem because he basically raped her and desired for her to be his wife. Another mention of Dinah is in Genesis 46, verse 15. She's listed among those who had accompanied Jacob back to Egypt. And that's all in the story of Joseph, which we'll come to in a later class. But this is all about Jacob's sons. This is where the emphasis is. And what we find in verses 1 through 21 is that they were born from different women, all of which were associated with Leah and Rachel. So altogether, in addition to the 4 sons born from Leah at the end of chapter 29, Jacob had 6 additional sons in these verses and 1 daughter. Now, just doing the math, 2 were born through Bilhah, Rachel's maid. 2 were born through Leah's maid, Zilpah. Finally, if you're going with Leah being able to have children again, 2 would have been born through Leah herself, in addition to 1 daughter. So that's 6 sons altogether, plus 1 daughter, 7 children altogether. But then we come back to Rachel in verses 22 through 24, where we see the aspect of God's help in all of this. So what does verse 22 say about God and the relationship with Rachel? What did God do, in other words? Opened her womb. What does that mean? She became pregnant, gave her the ability to have children. But the text also said he remembered Rachel and gave heed to her. So that's just a way of saying that God expressed concern toward Rachel. He heard Rachel's prayers and answered them in her favor. So he opens her womb, gave her the ability to have her own children. As a result, verse 23, the author goes on to record that Rachel conceived and bore a son. And what does Rachel say there in verse 23? God has taken away my reproach. Can anyone tell me what the word reproach means? Okay. Disgrace. It's a word that means disgrace. It can be shame, humiliation, any one of those words. So what does it mean God has taken away my reproach? Okay, she's vindicated. That goes back to earlier in the context. Now, why would she have felt shame and reproach?
Because they thought it was necessary to have children, male children,
Maybe that,
carry on the line.
okay, it was
Since she didn't have any, she felt she was under reproach from God because of that.
absolutely. So now she's had this child. She's no longer has a reason to feel shame. Because again, this is the cultural mindset we're looking at. If a woman didn't have children, they were not in good shape in their own minds. So now she's had a child, and she feels God has taken it away. As a result, the son receives the name Joseph. And she adds there, may the Lord give me another son. Now, what's the prayer there after she names her son Joseph? She wants more children. She's had one, so she asks God, may I have another one? Now, as that's associated with the name Joseph means, may God add children. So she gives her son this name because it's a prayer that God might give her another son. Now, in addition to those things, since that's true, what Rachel says here also functions as a prophecy of sorts, because it does point forward to the second son that God would give her just before her death in Genesis 35, the 12th son of Jacob. Joseph is number 11. Number 12 would not come until Genesis 35. Number 12 is named Benjamin. But Benjamin's name was originally Ben-Oni. That's Benoni. Because Benjamin was born to Rachel as she was dying. In other words, Rachel died at his birth. When you read Genesis 35, she endured severe labor, and she named him Benoni, which is the son of sorrow, or something along those lines. I'd have to go back. So the prayer Rachel prays as she gives Joseph his name would be answered by God in a positive manner through the birth of Benjamin. It's Jacob that gives him the name Benjamin after Rachel has died. Questions or comments on that? I know that's a lot of information. Okay. So putting verses 22 through 24 together, the point we should see from these verses concerning the birth of Jacob's sons is that Jacob's sons were born with God's help. Now, in these verses, the author has shown that if it were not for God's help, Rachel could not have possibly had children. This is something that Rachel recognized, which is one reason she gives her son the name Joseph. And that's a request that God might give her another son, which God would do for Rachel in Genesis 35. Now, in conclusion, when we consider everything that's been recorded in this chapter of Genesis, is that Jacob had more sons. They were born from different women. They were born from God's help. So again, the application, at least one application, is that the good things that happen in our lives come from God's help. God helped Jacob to have the sons that he did in addition to the daughter. And so when we're given good things, we should recognize those good things could not happen without God's help. So we, like Rachel, in praying for children, we too must be seeking God's help, and we do that through prayer and whatever concerns we might have in our lives. If and when we do this, we can trust that God will help us in ways we might not expect. So those are just a few applications. Any other questions or comments on what we've looked at today? Alrighty. Don, will you close us today?